time. My name is Ellen Clayton, and I am delighted to introduce Professor Jennifer Wagner to you. As you can see from her title slide, she is an assistant professor at Penn State University and is affiliated with a wide array of departments ranging from law, policy, engineering, and anthropology. She has been a licensed attorney since 2007, and her interdisciplinary research focuses on the human right to science, privacy, and equity in genetic and digital health technologies. She has published over 70 articles, gotten NIH funding, and her work has been cited by the US Supreme Court. And she serves on numerous editorial boards and National Ethics Committee. And so without further ado, I will turn this over to Jen.
Great. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I do want this to be mainly a discussion instead of me talking at everyone. So hopefully that's what everyone had in mind when they joined today. So we're going to talk a little bit about data management in the extremes. And just before I get started, the usual disclaimers here, right? I have financial interests, including NIH funding, but that did not contribute directly to the work that I'm going to talk to you about, although I have a couple of slides where I do flag the funding that I had for some of the results that I'll share with you. And anytime I'm talking about legal information, I'm doing it as an informational kind of situation, not legal advice. So I think we're in these really interesting times of so many different extremes, right? So on the one hand, we have a real cause for optimism and celebration in the amount of data, the types of data that we can be generating and gathering and using for biomedical research, just really everywhere you look, right? Data are available and often affordable and accessible to us. And the computational power that we have today is just tremendous as well. So I'm drawing on kind of the Roaring 20s imagery here, but we're in the Roaring 20s of technology, I guess you could say, in the new millennium or the new century. So, I think that we do want to be celebrating what has been accomplished from a bioinformatics perspective, from a data science perspective, and look forward to opportunities to leverage the science and technology that we have here. But we also have this other extreme, which is we're in this time of distrust. We're in potentially a time of scientific devastation and despair over what we're going to do, how we actually manage these data responsibly. How do we make sure that these technologies are not used to just disrupt and destroy people's livelihoods and their lives and their health and well-being in so many different ways, right? And so we're thinking about the extremes of data management at a time when potentially there is NIH and other federal funding, cuts, right? That are worrisome because we want that support for research to continue, and it's going to be hard to continue this work if it doesn't persist. But also thinking about the risks that come with that, right? If there is more of an investment coming from the private sector for the science and the innovation, we have to anticipate that some of that will also result in putting up those barriers, putting back up those silos, and hiding data behind proprietary walls. And that's just not going to be a good situation for many of us, right? So we have these very, very different scenarios of how we could be looking at the situation. We could be very optimistic, but we also could be very worried about data harms, and those could take a wide variety of forms. So the biomedical data ecosystem is getting both more complex and more complicated, right? We have several large collaborations and consortia generating, collecting, aggregating, and broadly using and sharing multi-omics data, multimodal data, and you are familiar with some of them. It's why we're here today, right? The Bridge to AI initiative, the BRAIN initiative, and BBQS program, the Human Virome program, the All of Us research program. I could continue listing these on and on. These tremendous collaborations that are large scale and exciting in terms of what they might be able to illuminate. But we have so many outstanding ELSI questions and emerging nuances that need to be resolved, including, and I apologize for the typo on my slide, that next line wasn't supposed to be there, but we do have, concerns about exceptionalism in different types of data and how we manage those types of data. Should genetic and genomic information be given more protections than other forms of data? Should data that's generated in a clinical environment be given more protections than those that are created and used outside of a clinical setting? Those remain relatively unresolved in the United States. We have outstanding questions about equitable and universal informed consent processes, particularly when we have a proliferation of state laws on data protections. We also have these outstanding issues related to proxy discrimination and disparate impacts from AI-enabled science, dual use challenges, and boundaries of certificates of confidentiality and existing legal pathways that perhaps undermine the privacy rule protections that the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act would provide us, right? So lots of questions that we could be talking about here today. Um, One of the things that bothers me is not recognizing a shift in relative risks, right? So thinking about biomedical research and human research participation protections, one of the rules is to really think about the relative risk of participating in research versus the risks encountered in everyday life. And when we're thinking about data management, that requires us to think about the dataveillance risks that are happening in society all around us, regardless of whether the biomedical research moves forward or not. And so we've hit this bit of a change where, perhaps a lot of biomedical research was interventional and carried with it a lot of physical risk and would be, riskier than the risks encountered in everyday life. But we're seeing that flip, right? We're seeing that the risks encountered in everyday life for data valence are really burdensome. They're heavy, and they're hard for us to wrap our minds around. Thinking about the many different types of data that are all around us, some of which are in HIPAA governed spaces and most of which are not, right? So in addition to these challenges, IRBs and others who are providing the oversight for data science often don't know how to weigh those relative risks of the research with everyday encounters. There's not, in my view, a systematic way that is done across institutions. And part of that is perhaps not surprising, given the data risks of individuals are not uniform, they're not equal, and they certainly aren't static. And by that, I mean constant and unchanging, right? We have a wide range of behaviors in our modern datafied cultures. We have individual data risks and collective data risks that vary quite dependent on our own behavior, right? We have digital minimalists trying to be off grid, trying to minimize their digital footprint and shadows. But we then have quantified selves who are really interested in all the data about themselves that they could possibly be generating and using for their own personal utility. So our identities and affinities, the many descriptive categories that get assigned to each of us, along with our intersectionality, create distinct modes or paths of privilege and oppression and marginalization in this datafied culture. And I think that we need to grapple with how wearables and apps and other information technologies integrated with digital health and broader biomedical research projects, um, I think they require different considerations than, say, a situation where technology is developed in-house in a clinical setting for the research purpose itself and not otherwise available. How we interact with technology vendors is different. Some of us maybe prefer Apple computers, some of us prefer, Google or Microsoft or what have you. You have the major tech players, but then you also have, the number of startups and smaller tech companies. And we don't necessarily act consistently across different settings or across different moments of time. So these differences implicate biases, they implicate discrimination, autonomy, human dignity, and increasingly we need to pay attention to digital dignity and how we will perform research responsibly and manage data to carry out, say, synthetic clinical trials. Right. So we have these data risks that are not uniform. They're complicated, as Danielle Keats-Citron and Daniel Solove have taught us with some of their work. There are many different types of privacy harms. Some of them are physical, reputational, relationship harms, economic harms, discrimination harms, psychological harms, and emotional distress and disturbances, as well as autonomy harms, right? Coercion, manipulation, failures to inform, thwarted expectations, and the like. And that's hard for us to wrap our minds around and come up with a standard approach that will work in every instance. So we're also in a situation where legal frameworks in which we're operating were designed for these siloed data practices, and they're buckling, right? They're buckling under the tension of this intentional desiloing of data for precision health purposes. And it not only ushers in these opportunities for research, but also causes a wide array of collateral damage, right? So there's been recent work by Bomasani et al. In, I believe it was Science, calling for the need to bridge these fragmented communities of different expertise so that we can get this right. I mentioned the whole issue of wearables and tech and whether it's available already direct to consumer off the shelf versus, is this something in development as part of the research? That's one consideration, right? In terms of whether the data might already be generated, whether or not the research moves forward. But there are also hidden partnerships and business ventures between healthcare systems and academic institutions doing the research, as well as the software vendors, including electronic health record vendors and the like, that by and large the public doesn't really appreciate or doesn't understand, right? We're not really in the days of getting all of our medical care from cradle to grave from the same person or even the same clinic. There are many people involved in carrying out the healthcare operations, and that requires data, right? And so the modern data practices in the biomedical space go largely hidden, and so that creates another kind of problem, another extreme in terms of appreciation of what those risks might be and the ability to effectuate your preferences through informed consent or any other process. Um, I mentioned that we have a number of state laws that are popping up, creating some unclear protections or unequal protections for data across the different states. So we have 4 states with biometric specific laws. We have 3 states with neural data laws. We have 3 states with consumer health privacy laws. And 19 or 20, the number might have gone up since I was preparing these slides, of what they call comprehensive data protection laws across the states, not to mention 4 states that have AI specific laws. And yet, even in these states where there have been a proliferation of legislative activities to shore up data protections, 0 of them explicitly address multimodal data. We looked at 40 laws across 22 states. So they don't explicitly cover that. They don't explicitly cover microbial data or microbiome data, human virome data. No, they don't talk about that either. So what are we to do? Are we to assume that those data are special and that all of these laws no longer apply just because of the new technology, a new omic has come to being? I would argue no. I think that's a risky way to approach our situation. But the states do vary in their carve-outs for data that are governed already by HIPAA and data that are coming out of research and clinical contexts. Navigating this space is tremendously difficult. And we're seeing this shifting, unclear, uncertain expectation pop up, specifically in genetics research and related research for health purposes, coming from some of the ambiguities in the policies that are there, lack of definitions, for example. What counts as an NIH controlled access database in order to wonder if certain policies do or do not apply? If you actually look at the various policies, you'll see it's not defined. And that lack of clarity, that patent ambiguity, is really problematic and makes it more difficult for everyone. So we're seeing this situation where we have technical debts and moral debts, and these are all compounding. So I would argue that HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and its High Tech Act, I would argue they're largely functionally obsolete, right? We're trying to thread the needle between individual access, portability, interoperability, as well as privacy and security. I think, we're doing an okay job, I guess, but I think we still are struggling with that quite a bit. We are seeing the HIPAA knowledge gap play out with unreasonable expectations about what could and should be kept private versus what could and should be shared for the societal benefit that could come out of biomedical research using those data. We still don't have, for example, a return on data use score, right? An ROI for what a particular piece of data might get. And so that's really challenging. We're seeing de-identification continue to be relied upon as a means to greenlight research and greenlight secondary use of these data. And that's challenging in this computational environment where it might not take so many expertise, like so many years of expertise and training in order to be able to re-identify someone from their data. The triangulation, when you have so much data, it makes it quite feasible. And then also, I mentioned multimodal data and multimodal AI, which raises its own set of unique challenges, where it's not just aggregating data that already exists and information that already exists. It's also generating new insights that maybe weren't envisioned at the time people might have agreed to participate in one form of research or another. So I think we've long held on to this illusion of de-identification, right? The genome and everyone's face is identifiable, right? We wouldn't have facial recognition technology coming up if it weren't. We wouldn't be worried about DNA identification in the forensic space if it weren't. And yet we treat these in very extreme ways. In the biomedical health space, we pretend that the identifiability of those data and biospecimens don't exist or that they can be effectively minimized. And in the forensic space, we ignore the fact that there is a lot of health inferences, that could be created through different types of DNA analyses if they're not carefully controlled. And so I think this is somewhat concerning. We know that privacy and non-discrimination are not synonymous, but they are intertwined. And additionally, we're in the midst of this kind of rapid, volatile, and extreme deregulation that gives us concern about who is actually going to ensure data management practices adhere to what's being promised, right? Are maintaining fidelity with informed consent and data use agreements. We need to pay attention to those issues. So there could be ways that we think about solving this. I mean, is it time that we have perhaps an expiration date or a sunset date on informed consent, whereby after a certain amount of time, it's just required that you have to go back and have renewed conversations to better contextualize the risks that go along with those data for research purposes, given the current context, whether that's socio-political context or the individual and group considerations that might go into that. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I know that perhaps the dangers of relying on stale informed consent documentation are analogous to relying on a stale, expired, drug prescription, right? Those have expiration dates because we want to make sure that we're treating the conditions and the circumstances with the knowledge that we have and an understanding of whether or not those will be helpful or not. So I think that that's quite important. We're all navigating these turbulent times in different ways, right? Data literacy and ethical literacy affects our experiences in the midst of these AI-enabled data waves. And finding our way, whether that's through engagement or disengagement, is critical. And so I worry about taking the human out of it and having this expansion of secondary data analyses without careful consideration of the people who might be involved. And I just want to share with you a little bit of unpublished data that I have that lends support to some of my views. So in 2021, we conducted a survey across the United States of adults, and we deployed a two-item assessment just to try to gauge data literacy. I'll mention that there is no data literacy scale that's been validated for use in this way, which is quite frustrating and even helping us understand how we can bridge those divides between disciplines, between, professionals and non-professionals and the like. And we found that only 1 in 6 of the respondents actually were able to, have a understanding of de-identified data and what that means and what re-identifiability risk meant. 1 in 6 reported that they had kept information private because they were from their healthcare providers because they were concerned about privacy and security. And only 1 in 3 were more than somewhat familiar with their healthcare organization's notice of privacy practices. Okay. Um, we also looked at perspectives with healthcare and technology partners. I'm showing here on the slide the results related to kind of big tech, right? Facebook, now called Meta, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Apple. And you'll see that it runs the spectrum of different perspectives in terms of how they think those corporations care about data practices and using data responsibly. Healthcare organizations did have the benefit of the doubt there. They had more favorable responses than the other tech vendors. We looked at electronic health record vendors as well, and those looked quite interesting. So hopefully we'll be able to publish these for you soon. Um, some similar work that we looked at, just thinking about data management in the extremes, is thinking about synthetic data and the role that synthetic data could play, the role that ELSI-focused computational checklists might play in ensuring that people who are collecting and generating and using the data are doing so in a responsible manner that it takes into account these ethical, legal, and social implications. And what we found was that there was a majority of our survey respondents. Now, granted, this was a small survey size, and this was from 2023 of ethics and AI machine learning developers or users, so data scientists broadly, from Association of American Medical Colleges. A majority of the respondents didn't have a favorable or non-favorable view of synthetic data. 2/3 of the respondents actually preferred real, actual data over synthetic data, right? So it's unclear why that might be. It could be due to lack of familiarity. A majority indicated that synthetic data could somewhat address privacy and bias concerns. But respondents were divided over whether an IRB should oversee the use of synthetic data in biomedical contexts. Um, on the ELSI computational checklist side, 92% of our respondents were supportive or strongly supportive of the idea of having an ELSI computational checklist. And a majority of respondents also indicated that they thought that having these ELSI-focused computational checklists would actually increase the quality of attention that these issues were going to be given by those who are making and developing and using the AI models and data sets. So, it remains to be seen whether that's the case. I could share with you some data on adult perspectives on biometrics just to help, again, us think about the data management in these extremes. It's not just all data are alike. Sometimes we care about different types of data in interesting ways. So we have so many biometrics, and the technological advances are only making that clearer, right? Your voice. You only need a few seconds for a voice print to be possible. And for that to be used, as we're seeing in news reports, in very worrisome ways to scam and defraud members of the public, often elderly members of the public who think they are trying to help a family member in need, right? So how do we think about protecting biometric source material and the biometric identifier itself? It's not immediately apparent, and it's not clear whether we should be handling all of these data types in the same way. We had conducted some research a few years back on how people felt about different biometrics, and we had them rank them, and you probably wouldn't be surprised to know that the US adults are more comfortable with fingerprints than they are with DNA, and facial imaging comes pretty much in the middle. But even if we're thinking about one biometric, privacy concerns that get expressed by US adults vary quite dramatically. And it's unclear at this point in time whether those concerns relate to the technology that's necessary to basically manage your own risks, right? Or the technology or expertise that's needed to re-identify someone or do something that's going to be harmful with those data. Or if it's actually something simpler than that, like how invasive it might be to have those data generated, right? And so we see here the imaging data. They're not as concerned about imaging data from still imaging data as they might be from a 2D photo, a 3D photo, or a video, right? So the concerns seem to go up based on perhaps the amount of information that you can glean from them. The more limited it is, for example, a geometric surface map, just numbers, right, as opposed to an image could make a difference. But interestingly, professional perspectives on biometrics don't necessarily show an ethics literacy that we would want, right? The ability to spot those ethical issues, to reason through them, and use moral imagination to come up with viable solutions. This 2020 survey that had been published shows that researchers who were involved in facial recognition technology research or facial recognition algorithm development basically thought, a lot of them, almost 20%, thought that you can freely use any online photos without approaching anyone at all, right? That's somewhat frustrating. um, and also, there were varying perspectives on what should happen with vulnerable populations. Is it going to be ethically acceptable as long as the population gives consent? Maybe, or maybe it's questionable even if they have informed consent. And of course, there are the difficulties of nuance when what does it mean for a population to give consent as opposed to individuals? That is not easy to operationalize, even if you're trying to base your decisions on consent, right? I actually think that what I want to do is move forward quickly so that we can get to discussion because I've already talked more than what I had intended to. But I'll say that we're continuing to think about the way data practices are managed in and out of healthcare and biomedical research settings, and we're going to have to take that into account even more. The FTC has played a role in this. I mentioned we're seeing emerging laws across the states. This is still tricky though, because everyone has different definitions. BIPA has a pretty comprehensive definition, but then when you see what it excludes, it basically defaults some biometric identifiers or some potential materials that you would think would be included. It excludes them because they're already governed by GINA or JIPA or the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. I mentioned the variation in these comprehensive data protection laws, and I'll just mention that even in those laws, the definitions vary in terms of what might be covered or not. This one is from California, and biometric information is much broader, perhaps stronger than GDPR in the European Union, in that specifically raw biometric data or source materials like voice recordings and photographs would be covered by this definition. But then you have to fall back to their exceptions and their exemptions, which vary by state too. It makes it extremely difficult. And we're still falling into this old habit of de-identification as our crutch, as I mentioned, even if there were back when this was introduced, which was many years ago at this point, there was a consideration made for biometrics data and different kinds of data that would raise re-identifiability concerns. And I'll end with just the comment that I think we really need to advance human rights to health, science, and privacy together. We shouldn't be thinking about privacy and data management as something that is holding us back, hampering the research from moving forward. We need to do this in a responsible manner and finding ways that we can thread that needle of access and privacy protections is going to be critical. Now, in light of some of the updates that have been happening, the disruptive, extreme deregulatory situation that's happening in the legal sphere in the United States right now, we do have to be concerned about whether any kind of governance guidance or practice norms are going to be coming from the top down government, mandated kinds of protections and practices. We're seeing that that is actually likely to not be the case, right? And so what does this mean? It means that we're probably going to expect increased litigation and the proliferation of regulatory ambiguities that might discourage investment. It might delay market entry for technologies that we think would advance some of the research that we want to see happen. But it also puts the onus on us that as part of the biomedical research community, we need to figure out how to manage in a grassroots way, in an enforceable way, that's going to be effective. I'm not going to get into this, but some of my colleagues and I have proposed an approach that might work, but we need to pilot it, right? We need people to actually step in and say, yeah, let's see if that might work. So, I think that we are going to be in the state of extremes for some time. It might make us dizzy, given that there aren't any clear answers. There's no path forward that's obvious, and compromise is going to be necessary. But being mindful of the challenges that all of these extremes bring, I think is going to help us, right? Being mindful of the disciplinary divides that we have and understanding what synthetic data are, what their capabilities and limitations are, is going to be crucial. I think that just finding a better way to deal with data literacy problems that we have in communicating what's being done between professionals and non-professionals, because I think we can't begin to have effective informed consent be the approach if we don't even know where people are starting, right? We need to meet people where they are so that they can understand the opportunities and challenges and figure out a way to make it make sense for them. So I'm going to stop there and stop sharing my screen so that we can have a bit of a conversation. I'm sure there are questions.
Um, well, that was a stunning talk, and um, I have a couple, and I'm confident that people are going to have raised their hand, and I will call on them if they do. And you haven't noticed that there's actually been a fairly vigorous discussion in the chat, which is always very exciting. I want to ask you two questions.
Okay.
Um, how much weight do you really give to informed consent in that uh, I think many of us think that it is asked to bear too much weight, um, and that at least there are some uses that should be possible for without that kind of consent. So that's one thing that I would ask you about. And again, just people raise your hands if you want to talk.
Yeah, I'll say I do think that we put too much weight behind informed consent. And I think that there is something to be said for forcing us all into the same situation. Having some sort of solidarity in our vulnerability, I think could be one way that makes us think twice. But even there, I do worry in our current environment in the United States, and I'll preface this by saying I'm fixed in the United States mindset right now, for purposes of this work. I think we run into the very different perspectives of what's okay, what's acceptable. And so I'm not sure that even an all-in kind of approach is going to work in the United States if it were if it were pushed forward in that way. I do think we need to have some consideration in terms of how much the informed consent process actually biases the data and the research that's able to move forward. So in some ways, I think maybe we should be pausing to engage communities, listen to individuals with perspectives that might be a little bit more reluctant, to make sure that we're taking those considerations into account first, as opposed to trying to, have the research move forward with a majoritarian kind of popular perspective and then try to rework it after the fact to help people, because I think that that just will be ill fit.
And then my follow-on question is, as you well know, NIH actually only likes the safe harbor. I mean, when they talked about de-identification, they said explicitly that's the thing to do.
Right.
What about the other thing, the expert determination that actually says very small risk. I realize that that's vague, but at least it, you know, but at least it can take into account the systems that you might put into place to try to protect data. Um, and at least it's sort of more realistic because your business about biometrics is really spot on.
Yeah, I wish that work would move forward with the expert determination method for de-identification, particularly because it helps us situate the risks in the moment in a much better way than doing it in this, well, it's de-identified. We stripped it of these links, so it must be okay. I worry because you don't need those links, right? Right. At some point when you're aggregating the data back up, you're going to be able to figure out who's who. And so then the onus becomes how strictly are you enforcing your codes of conduct, your data use agreements, and setting appropriate remedies for harms when someone says they aren't going to attempt to re-identify, but lo and behold, they do. And how do we actually build feedback loops so that, if that happens, we actually know about it, right? I mean, I think that's one of the concerns that I have is that we'll just force some of this underground, and people will do the work, they just won't talk about it.
So Camille has come on and off the screen. Do you have something to ask, Camille?
I thank you so much, Jen. This was really great. And I think we have probably 3 times the number of people that normally attend. So
Wow.
kudos. I think we're getting the word out that this is not only is available to everyone, but the topic is just super important. And so when you think about the stewardship, which is, I think, one of the most important facets of data management, once we make data public, available for download by anyone who says that they have been trained and won't do harm,
Mhm.
what is the minimum qualification that one should have to access publicly available human health data? I mean, if the ship has sailed and the data are public and all you need to do is attest that you won't re-identify or stigmatize, I sometimes wonder if people don't know when they're doing something that leads to a risk to a person. So I think there's,
Right.
like, as clinicians are trained in, they get licensed, they have accreditations. Computational scientists may not have that same entry into their field. So contrasting the computational world with the clinical world, there's a whole different set of qualifications that one needs to have. So what do you need to pilot the plane in this case?
I mean, I think you need to understand the data that you're working with or potentially working with, right? So having those explanations up front before you actually get access and making sure that you understand the data ahead of time, I think is going to be important. But also understanding why those various protections came to be in place, for data scientists in more traditional settings, right? Before open science came on the scene, before we were really trying to share data in this way, understanding the human research participant, harms that had occurred and the hope that we won't let them occur even with secondary data uses. Now, that said, I worry about over reliance on some sort of credential as being a substitute for understanding. I worry about that. And I also worry about trying to protect the data so much that we're actually eliminating the ability for individuals to know what data are out there and to be able to train and get that experience. So I'm torn. I'm torn.
So it sounds
I
like data sheets are really important. A
I
data
think
sheet
they
that
are.
describes the origin, the provenance, all the quality of the products that were used to collect.
I think they are. And I will say that some of the work with the ELSI focused computational checklist that we had done, we had this overwhelming support that yes, this would be a good thing if we could have the ELSI metadata and, do things that would help automate that process a little bit more, that would be a good thing. But when we had a national working group really, sitting down for several hours trying to think about what that would look like, what pieces would be in there, and how would they actually be implemented. everyone kind of looked around and said, well, I don't have this expertise to say that. Like, I don't have the expertise to make this decision. Well, if not us, who would be those who would be those people to do that, right? And even a starting point, I think, would be better than nothing. And testing it out and seeing, oh, well, computational checklists and benchmarking sometimes gets a bad rap because once there's a benchmark, you'll game the system, right? Maybe you'll find a way to just check the box. But I think there is a learning curve there, and sure, maybe some people will do that, but for others, it can help set norms.
Thank you. Yeah, we're spending quite a bit of time developing data sheets and health sheets to document. And it's going to be a work in progress because it's relatively novel. We probably have people on the call today that are heavily involved in that.
There's no shortage of work to be done, I think.
So I mean, I can talk with Jen all day, but are there others who really want to ask a question? Because this is your opportunity. Michael Chang?
Yeah, I have a question. Jennifer, I thought that was a fabulous overview.
Thank
And
you.
I think that my question really parallels what I'm reading in the chat box. That I feel like society has moved forward very quickly. And in the non-medical world, there are click-through consents where people give access to highly personal data, generally without even reading, what's in those things that they agree to. And everybody's just used to it. And I love that the biomedical research field has a higher level of oversight, which is really the premise of your talk. Um, but I guess in 2025, what we're all seeing is that there's enormous heterogeneity in terms of what different groups around the country are doing. What is considered de-identified, what's considered ethical, and we saw this in Bridge to AI, where different ethicists on the same team, sometimes had different opinions, and it was very confusing. And so my question is, do you have a concept of how we as a national society could move forward to develop standard policy for this? Because there's so much heterogeneity. And what do we need to do? Like, what could we at NIH do to advance this? And who do we need to be working with to basically try to solve this problem of like what's considered the right thing to do? I just love your perspectives on that.
Oh, thank you. So a great question. I mean, you're bringing up that society has moved forward. They've certainly adopted the technologies quickly, and I think one of the concerns is whether or not there's this learned helplessness or there's just everyone has given up. It's not that they consent; it's that they don't know how they would navigate the datafied culture that we live in without doing that, right? So they're making those trade-offs of convenience and wanting to be in the know and wanting to use that tool, perhaps not realizing what the data risks are, and perhaps not recognizing the partnerships that those companies might be having with biomedical researchers or other companies or data brokers and the like. And so I think that there is a real danger in turning towards what's happening in, out in non-biomedical spaces and say, well, we should adopt that because we are holding up research. The burdens are too great, right? And for what reason? We want to make sure that whatever we're putting into place, it should be supporting the evidence base being generated, right? That's what I would like to see more kind of data management at IRB levels in terms of their considerations and consistencies and decision making and things like that, because there is a wide variety there. The other aspect that I think could help with addressing this in terms of standardization or thinking through this would be having clarity in the guidance that's already available, whether it's from the NIH or from others, in terms of what is acceptable and what's not. This whole not having terms defined clearly, right, gives opportunity for interpretation. And when you go to an IRB or you're going to an organization's privacy, chief privacy officer or their chief legal officer, their concern is for the organization's risk mitigation, not necessarily the individuals who are participating in research. And those are different scenarios. So perhaps if we had, maybe institutional review boards that were less attached to the institutions maybe might be helpful, but I don't know. I mean, that would be such a dramatic shift from what we have now. I don't know that that would be viable either. But I think having these large consortium, you know, so we have just for two examples of ones that I'm involved with right now, the BBQS program and the Human Virome Project. You know, I think to their credit, they are having these ELSI components to them, required components. But I think there needs to be more done to ensure that those are really integrated into the projects and that it's not just lip service to get through the door to get the funding. That's my concern, because then what ends up happening is that the ELSI folks look like the bad guys, right? We look like the ones slowing everything down, or that we're not letting things, you know, progress. And that's not the fact. That we want to help this research be sustainable and successful. And that takes time in the beginning. And so by not having those expectations in terms of engagement with the collaborators in place from day zero, I think we're putting ourselves at a disadvantage. But yeah, I don't have an answer, a single answer. I think we all just need to keep doing, you know, doing something to try to get us moving in the right direction.
Jennifer, I really loved listening to what you said, and I think every single thing you said made sense to me. As I've been processing that, you know, my vantage point is that coming from NIH, you know, what I see, and after having been in academia, uh, I feel like what I see is different IRBs, even from top 10 or top 5 institutions, when shown the same thing, come up with opposite
Right.
determinations sometimes. And another thing that I have a concern about is that groups may feel like they are penalized for trying to do the right thing, what they feel like is the right thing ethically. They may feel scientifically penalized with higher barriers. And I guess another concern that I have is that I institutions and data sometimes translates to money. Like people can take data to
Sure.
monetize it. And my concern is that I worry that that's a bias toward considering it de-identified. You know, when there's a gray zone and there's money involved, that there's inherent vagueness, and that muddies the waters a little bit. And I just feel like somebody, my question is, what can we at NIH do to help be the so-called adults in the room, to if we're the right ones, or if there's somebody else to do it? Because I mean, we've really been struggling with this, and I'll stop with that. But just this is, as you can tell, been on all of our minds.
Yeah, I mean it's a real challenge, and I think that some of it is, you know, who has the ability to hold out the carrots and sticks. Right? And make those changes happen. Perhaps if there was some sort of mandated schedule for the first, you know, few months that you have to have these foundational conversations, that you have to share your IRB protocols or your, you know, share different documents so that an inventory can be done across the consortium to see if everyone's doing basically the same thing in terms of their data practices. You know, maybe we don't have to have 20 meetings talking about how we might navigate differences if we're all in a general same space. But having that ability to do an inventory would let us see where those differences are and would let us get more efficient in those conversations, I think. So even if we're talking about humans versus non-human animal research, I think that's a challenge, you know, that we need to grapple with, right? So having more specificity could be helpful. And I would say specificity with grace, because there are context-specific considerations that need to be taken into account. And a research project done at one specific location might not be raising the same risks as in another location. And having that flexibility would be important. You know, I'm thinking about the HIPAA, it's a Safe Harbor Act that was passed in 2021. This is not the same safe harbor that's the de-identification for the privacy rule. It's separate. This was actually a law that was passed to improve data security measures. And I think that they tried to get the right, approach there by promoting reasonable practices, right? Recognized security practices need to be adopted. And if they're adopted, then we'll give you a little bit of we'll give those who are overseeing and enforcing that law have more discretion in terms of whether they, put the hammer down for violations, or if it's more of a, okay, this was a problem, what did we do? Are we, going to engage in corrective action? So maybe something like that could be useful. But I think we're going to be in these challenging spots for a long time, particularly if money, if the quantity of funding for research gets smaller, it's going to be even more competitive. And those challenges that we're seeing related to the money aspect and being the first, having the innovative work is just going to get exacerbated.
I'm going to make a quick comment here, and then I'm going to call on Andre. This is a recommendation for the NIH too. One of them is that you have to have almost a run-in period for these projects that are so big, so that you can actually get the rules of the game straightened out. And the second thing you need to do is to require that ELSI be incorporated into the project. That has not happened in Bridge, for the most part, and I think that it is. I mean, I think there is a tremendously important example from ELSI and Genome, where it is just absolutely in the DNA. I do that obviously deliberately, that you involve ELSI early and often, and it's right there. And that has to happen. And so having said that, now I'll call on Andre.
Thank you. So I wanted to follow up. I made the comment in the chat, but I really wanted to voice this comment here as well. I think it's extremely important whenever the discussions are about the risks in identification and safeguarding patient privacy. Those are considered in balance with the benefits of having data publicly available and the consequences of introducing additional barriers for the scientists that want to access the data, because this will inevitably lead, I think there are studies about this, that this will inevitably lead to a reduced use of data, reduced innovation, and so forth. And furthermore, I think there are quite a few institutions, I know quite a few of them, that are very risk averse. And when they hear a comment, what we should expect is more litigations, and what we should do is share less. Very often the safest way forward is to not share anything, because then you don't risk anything. So there are those extremes, and we just need to be careful talking about those. And then the second comment I wanted to make, you talked about the healthcare data collected in research domain, but what about those enormous corporations that right now with mobile devices, smart devices, wearables, smart home devices, they collect enormous amount of data? Arguably, this is also healthcare data. It was demonstrated on many occasions. It can be traced to the individual, but those kind of organizations have very strong armies of lawyers. And I don't know, I personally don't know, maybe I can be educated. What are the safeguards that those companies need to implement? Who is auditing those safeguards? Who is protecting the interests of those consumers who don't even know what they're consenting for? And it's all very often click through, right? We are talking about, should we change the consent? We are consenting every day, like opening the website, opening the phone, and we don't even know what we are consenting for, right? So I don't know, maybe you can comment on that type of healthcare data.
I absolutely can comment on that kind of data. So one of my projects was consumer protections for genomics and precision health. And my focus was looking at all the agencies that get overlooked, right? Not the FDA. I was looking at the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and thinking about data practices in all of those spaces that don't necessarily know they have to comply with HIPAA and the High-Tech Act. There have been some changes recently, but it doesn't go far enough. So I will say there have been 2 federal bills that were introduced in the past few years that actually looked like they might have had momentum to help us with exactly that situation. In getting around the why are we defining different types of data, when if it's personal, if it's related to the individual, we should be handling it carefully across the board, whether you're in a financial institution or a school or a hair salon, whatever, right? Because the data are going to move around, they're going to flow, and they are going to flow with transfers of money. And we need to be mindful of that. And just because you might want to use it in a way that has, implications for your health or your well-being, that doesn't necessarily change the situation. And so data brokers had the attention of regulators or legislators for some time, as far back as 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014. They were trying to deal with data brokers and consumer data. That's why you're seeing the proliferation of state laws pop up now in that space. I didn't get to this in my talk, but the ones that are defining consumer health data, they're actually making those tech providers, the wearable providers and the like, protect their data in a HIPAA-like space. They're basically forcing everyone into the HIPAA environment, even if they wouldn't have been considered a covered entity or a business associate otherwise. So we're starting to see some attempts to standardize that, but it's very piecemeal, which again makes it very difficult if you're trying to do a study that engages the entirety of the country and people who are all over the place, some of whom have those protections and some of them don't. I think that the whole issue of consent, I'm thinking back to some talks that John Wilbanks gave several years ago when we were thinking about e-consent. And there was a pushback about using e-consent for research, biomedical research. And we thought, well, why is this so special that we shouldn't be thinking about this even as a possibility? The intent is to build that friction into the system. It's not to make it easier for biomedical research to get that click wrap accomplished. It's to make people pause and consider at least the high level. Here's the big picture of what this study is going to do. Here's the big picture of how your data could be used, both for this project and after the fact. How do you feel about it? Or, having them do some reflection and consideration before you jump in, because we all have the tendency to just jump in if we were going to, or we wouldn't even open, we wouldn't even open the app. We wouldn't even be engaging in the conversation. And so we have to welcome those kinds of tensions to have the ELSI considerations put into place. And I will say, I'm not about burdening the researchers unnecessarily. And I am a fan of data sharing. I'm a fan of open science. And I argue a lot for letting people, regardless of their training and expertise, and yes, even maybe regardless of their data literacy, have access to data, at least their own data, maybe not other people's data. And that's a distinction for me. So I think that's relevant. I do want to go back to Ellen's comment. I would say I second your request that the NIH try to make sure that ELSI components are front and center in these projects. And I would argue that one way to get behavioral change, to get that cultural shift that we want, is perhaps to have the ELSI scholars be the lead PI on the project, so that they have to be engaged. I mean, that is going to be that's controversial for sure. But if you are demonstrating, right, if you're doing this kind of virtue signaling about being responsible, you wouldn't have a problem collaborating in that meaningful way. So that could help too.
So 2 quick things. Well, first of all, thank you for that absolutely stunning talk. I forgot to mention that Camille's paper on ethical sourcing just got accepted yesterday at JAMIA Open. It will be out soon.
Excellent.
So really, really important. And the second thing is she put in a data sheet for AI Ready in the chat. So, we're putting our money where our mouth is. And so, but huzzah for all. So thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.